Good afternoon. Okay, we're winding down. We have a few more sessions, so we want to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for sticking in there and staying till we have these last few plenary sessions. So our next session will be on addressing historical environment injustices in communities of color. So we've all heard about the disparate impact that COVID-19 has had, environmental issues like the Flint water crisis. So we know that these types of environmental issues have a disparate impact on communities of color. Our next presenter is actually, he is an expert on environmental law. He will address some of these environmental injustices caused by air, water, and land contamination. He was appointed by President Joe Biden in the role of Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management at the Environmental Protection Agency and nominated to the U.S. Senate to serve as Assistant Administrator for the office. He is a Fulbright research scholar and is a former board member of the Environmental Law Institute and Natural Resources Defense Council. His views have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other media outlets. His forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press explores the historic and contemporary role of the United States Supreme Court in maintaining and dismantling racial dominance. Carlton Waterhouse is the professor of law and the founding director of the Environmental Climate Justice Center at Howard University School of Law. Please help me to welcome to the podium Carlton Waterhouse.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Diane. It's wonderful to be here today, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you all who are in the trenches on a daily basis doing the important work of protecting people's rights, human rights and civil rights. Today, I've been tasked with the pleasure of speaking with you all about addressing historical environmental injustices in communities of color, what I'm calling anti-racist environmental protection. Anti-racist environmental protection. And I am using that as an optional title because I think it gets to the heart of what I've been asked to speak about. And that also gets to the heart of one of the biggest flaws in environmental protection is the need to recognize the role that racism has played and continues to play in the environmental experiences of people across the country. So I'll begin this by going to a fundamental idea in the global context, and this is an international meeting, so it seems fitting that we should talk about the global context, and that idea can be found in what was called the Brundtland Report, when the world community came together under the United Nations auspices of dealing with environmental protection and recognized that development had to be sustainable, right? We couldn't just develop and build and construct and use industry in a way that wasn't sustainable. And to define what sustainability meant, they recognized that if you don't deal with the problems of human equality and the problems of inequities in human societies, you will not be able to address the ecological and environmental challenges that we face. Now, in America, that means we talk about sustainability a lot. We talk about sustainable buildings, and we talk about sustainable construction, and we talk about sustainable practices. But we don't like to talk about the inequality and the equity demands of sustainability. So we can say we've got a sustainable building, but we haven't really talked about who was involved in labor. We haven't really talked about displacement in the community. We haven't really talked about who will be able to take advantage and use that building. We haven't talked about racial issues. We haven't talked about issues of gender. We haven't talked about class. And yet we have a conception that we've done something sustainable because of the materials we used or the energy ratio or the way that we're taking advantage of the solar power that comes from the sun. And so those are what I call unsustainable developments. And the move towards an anti-racist environmental protection is grounded in the idea of sustainability, sustainable practices, sustainable development, which means that equity has to be centered. Not just in the same building, not down the hall away from where the decisions are being made, not somewhere in the basement, but equity is at the table and at the center of the conversation, right? So, for us, let's talk about why in the environmental context this is necessary. Well, as many of you all know, there are substantial racial disparities with regards to environmental exposures. One, if we think about air pollution, for example, as this slide will indicate, we'll find that people have very disparate rates of pollution exposure. We find that some of the reasons that are often given for these disparities are that people have different classes, and because some people are poor, therefore they have more exposure, or it has nothing to do with race, it's all about your income level. But that's just not borne out by the facts, right? And what we can see through examining the empirical data that is available to us is that race, irrespective of class, plays an outsized role in people's exposure to pollution. And your exposure to pollution is directly related to the impact that pollution has on your health and well-being. Not only your physical health, your psychological health, and your quality of life. Not only that, it also relates to your vulnerability to hazardous weather events, whether it's heat island effects, whether it's hurricanes, or whether it's wildfires. And so if we're going to deal with the problem of, or the issues of environmental quality and environmental protection, we have to take into account the reality of what people are experiencing on the ground. And what people experience on the ground is very much a racialized exposure to the dangers that come from the environment. Does this mean that only people of color are exposed to dangers from the environment? Not at all. Does this mean that all people of color are equally exposed to all the dangers in the environment? Not at all. But what it does mean is that people of color find themselves more vulnerable and more overburdened when it comes to pollutants and exposures and risk from climate change than their white counterparts. And that is relevant if we want to change it. If we're comfortable with it, then we can just ignore it. But if we actually want to bring about a change, then we're going to have to acknowledge and work from that framework. So, a few examples I put up around air, and I'll talk a little bit about asthma in a little while, but also you can see lead exposure and poisoning. This disparity with regards to lead exposure goes back 70 years easily, right, if not longer. And what we see with this disparity in lead exposure is that there's been substantial progress in removing lead from the environment. So children's blood lead levels used to be in the 50s, very routinely. Now it's down below 5. There's been drastic improvements, but you know, there also was drastic disparity. So African Americans in particular were disproportionately victims of elevated blood lead levels. And in fact, running 2 to 3 to 4 times higher than their white counterparts going back to the 1950s. Well, even though we've drastically decreased the number of children who have elevated blood lead levels, we have not scratched the surface on changing the disparity level of those who are still burdened by lead. So what it means is that fewer children overall have lead poisoning. But lead poisoning is still very real for children who are in our society, and they suffer the adverse effects on a daily basis. Long-term health effects, long-term effects in terms of children, their own ability to have children, long-term effects in terms of their cognitive ability. These are very real and very serious adverse effects that come from lead. And yet what we see is that children of color still disproportionately bear the burden of those adverse effects. So when we think about the racial disparities that exist, often we think, well, racial disparities are always on the decline because we are living in an era of progress, right? Well, of course, the same is not true, right? Everything from the way people talk about race or the way history is taught about race in some states in the South that begin with an F, wherever, we see is that progress is not always on a constant achievement level. In fact, we have real regress as well. And so we've seen that happen with regards to asthma rates and disparities in asthma rates. And so we find that disparities have grown concerning race and asthma in our society. And so we can't track everything to a legacy, a very real legacy of historic discrimination that is a large contributor to many of the racial disparities that we find exist in the environment. But we have to also recognize that decisions that are being made in the 2000s, 2010s, 2010s, 2020s are still causing environmental disparities for people of color today. Of course, there's a historic legacy, but as decisions are being made today, we are continuing that legacy or we are deconstructing that legacy. And the question is, in the environmental protection process, are we making decisions that are going to dismantle a legacy of disparity and disproportionate exposure and harm? Or are we going to continue the status quo? So, where is it that we find the origin or beginning of these disparities? Well, as I've already said, there are the disparities that result from the past decisions, and there are disparities that result from our ongoing decisions today. But many of these disparities are going to be the result of racial discrimination. Now, one of the problems we have in America is the way we talk about racial discrimination. And I want to just take a moment and say something about that. Because of the success in some ways of the civil rights movement, racial discrimination was defined in a very narrow way. Racial discrimination was defined in a way that the court that put Plessy versus Ferguson in place defined it. And how did the court define racial discrimination that put Plessy versus Ferguson in place? They defined it in a way that most of the abusive, the debilitating, the discriminatory practices of the Jim Crow South were considered not a violation of the Constitution and not an unconstitutional exercise of racial discrimination. In other words, the only way you can qualify as being guilty of racial discrimination is to have an intent to bring about some adverse harm to someone because of their racial identity. Now, a definition of racial discrimination that is equivalent to figuring out why someone committed murder to try to get to the intent of their actions puts a barrier on being able to effectively address racial discrimination because of how high the bar is to prove that it's happened. And as a society, America has become very affixed to discrimination being defined by Bull Connor, right? Fire hoses and dogs. And if you can't find Bull Connor and fire hoses and dogs, then maybe there's no discrimination, right? Because discrimination somehow is exclusively based on you being able to prove that someone's heart had a bad motive. But a discrimination that exists, that people experience, is the kind of discrimination that a enslaved African would have to live with a benevolent master who's still in slavery, right? There was no adverse intent. There was no animosity. In fact, there was often love. But there was a subordination that existed by that individual and an entire system of subordination that maintained an entire race of people in a subordinated status. That was discrimination. But it wasn't based necessarily on an intent to harm. It was based on an intent to subordinate and to take advantage of and exploit. And that element is exactly what we find when we find environmental discrimination. We find systems that exploit the subordination of people based on their racial identity. And that has many different manifestations, but the consequences are increased harm, increased vulnerability, increased exposure, increased levels of heart disease, increased levels of asthma, increased cases of COVID-19, increased mortality. The consequences are devastating. And yet, if you can't point a finger at someone who says, let's put that landfill in their neighborhood because they are Latino, then somehow it's okay. There's no problem. So that approach to environmental discrimination is not acceptable. That is not an anti-racist approach to environmental protection. That is, in fact, a status quo approach to environmental protection that will not move the needle. A race-neutral, rising tide raises all boats approach to environmental protection does not undo environmental injustice. In fact, it furthers environmental injustice because if the status quo of the system is biased against people of color, then maintaining the status quo continues the bias that exists against people of color. So there has to be a systemic change in how we approach the problem, or else the problem will remain. Let's look at this slide here. And this is a slide that Charles Lee has produced, who is one of the architects of toxic waste and race, one of the earliest studies demonstrating the disparity in exposure for African Americans and Latinos and Asians to hazardous waste sites around the country. And in this recent article he's done that I'm using from 2020, he notes the relationship between the history of redlining as we go back and look at the maps. And everybody's familiar with redlining, right? I know this is not the audience that I have to go to the background of redlining, but the history of redlining has produced geographic patterns for where people live across the country. And your exposure to pollution is, guess what? Directly related to where you live across the country. So the history of racial discrimination that was very intentional, very explicit, and not at all in question has established a foundation of racial disparities in terms of people's environmental exposure and harm. He shows that right here in this map that you see. And what it evidences is if you look at the California Environmental Screening Tool and map it onto the what's called the Mapping Inequalities Project's maps that goes back and finds the Federal Housing Administration's maps that they used to produce redlining from the 1937 map. It shows that all of the highlighted blocks, can everybody see the highlighted blocks in the map? They tend to be on the top right hand or on the right hand side of the map. Can everybody see that? Those like bordered? all of those bordered areas are areas that received a D. So under the Federal Housing Administration, what they did was they gave A's, B's, C's, and D's to score communities based on what they saw as their prospects for lending. You all understand how redlining worked, right? So the idea is an area that was a D was considered to be one that was not appropriate for lending. And an area that was an A was a great prospect for lending. And of course, lenders, banks, and financial institutions use these maps to decide who should be able to get a loan to buy a house. Now, of course, home ownership was the largest producer of wealth in American society, running from the 1930s down to the 1970s, right? And who was excluded from taking advantage of this wonderful opportunity? People of color. Because communities that had a percentage of people of color in an unacceptable level got the lowest score. So you could see how a history of discrimination obviously has an impact on wealth building that's taken place, right, throughout that last century. But also, if we look at this map, we can see it also tells us how likely you are to live in an area that is highly polluted. So you'll see that the areas that are on the map that are bordered are not the only areas that are highly polluted, but you can see that most of those areas are areas that have high levels of pollution because there is a correlation. And you can see the areas that have the highest pollution often are in close proximity to those areas, right? So let's move on. So what are the burdens that result from these environmental inequities that I'm talking about? So we can talk about climate and the impact of natural disasters and how easy it is for persons to bounce back or bounce forward from experiencing those natural disasters. What is the likelihood that they will experience the worst harms from those natural disasters? How easy is it for persons to get access to water that is clean and safe? How likely are you to live in a community that has combined sewer overflows, that when there's a significant rain event, the sewers back up in your neighborhood? How close are you to the facilities that hold all of our waste, or waste from neighboring states or neighboring counties or from neighboring industries? How likely is it that your children have lead pipes and lead solder and lead lines in their schools and in their water fountains and in their sinks? How likely is it that you are experiencing increased morbidity and disease as a result of environmental exposure? These are burdens that people bear in their everyday lives that are environmental burdens. When we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about reversing what is today the status quo. The status quo norm is environmental injustice. And why is it an injustice? It's an injustice because there's a distributional inequality and inequity in exposure to pollution. And so as I showed on the earlier slide, exposure to air pollution, exposure to lead, and many other examples that I didn't have time to go into, disproportionately fall on communities of color, often irrespective of their class or income status. That's a disproportionate distributional inequality or inequity. That's one way that environmental injustice happens, is because people are disproportionately exposed to pollution and disproportionately bear the burdens of pollution. But there are other kinds of injustices associated with pollution and environmental protection as well. And that goes to not only the burdens, but who receives the benefits, right? There are benefits that come from pollution. Let's be clear. It's not that the pollution itself produces benefits, but the pollution is a result of a process that has benefits to be had. So when we think about the burdens, they also are juxtaposed to benefits. But about burdens, before I get to benefits, let me just go through a few quick examples, talking about climate change, talking about environmental protection and the consequences of the failure to address pollution in the society. Climate change is a result to our failure to attend to pollution. The production of climate change causing gases, what we call greenhouse gases. The production of those gases is a result of a waste process. They don't do anything good for the environment. They come off as a waste. The result of that waste going into the atmosphere has shifted the way our climate works on a global level. The consequences of shifting the way the climate works at a global level is that things fall down. What is it? Something rolls downhill? Things roll downhill. And what's rolling downhill? Flooding. What's rolling downhill? Increased heat events. What's rolling downhill? Increased intensity of hurricanes. What's rolling downhill? Wildfires. And you see the production of the greenhouse gases is not the result of just your everyday life, though your everyday life is a part of it, but industry, the fossil fuel industry, the manufacturing sector, the industrialization of America and the industrialization of the world all have put massive levels of these greenhouse gases into the environment. Now, there are benefits that we all experience. Let's be clear. Most of us have access to some level of private transportation. That's a result of the fossil fuel industry. Many people have had their homes powered by electricity, the result of the fossil fuel industry, from electricity produced by coal to transportation powered by oil, gasoline, right? We've gained benefits. But you know who's gained even greater benefits? The shareholders in the coal companies, the shareholders in the petroleum industry. You know who's also gained greater benefits? The CEOs of those industries, the management in those industries, the highest paid employees in those industries, right? Massive benefits have been shared, but the burdens are disproportionately falling on certain populations around the world. The Flint water crisis, very avoidable crisis, a city manager making a decision to save money at the consequence of the health and well-being of the residents. Could have caught it earlier, but as residents complained about their water, they were disregarded because they were primarily African American and poor. Until a doctor got involved who wasn't part of that community, nobody was listening to the complaints of the people in the community, meaning the children were being exposed, and we didn't even know there was a problem until a doctor talked about the adverse health effects that people are already experiencing. So we can see, as a side note, environmental justice is not just about distribution of harm and benefit, but it's also about recognition. Who gets recognized when they start talking about an environmental problem? Whose voice gets heard? Who has the ability to change the way decisions are made? But there are also these environmental benefits other than the money that comes as a result of having shares in stock or a wonderful position of employment as a CEO of a major corporation or high-level management or high-paid skilled jobs in plants and facilities. There's also the massive benefits of having clean air, clean water, and clean green spaces around you. The benefits of having the pleasure of going to walk in natural spaces that aren't polluted. The ability to have trees in your neighborhood can decrease the temperature up to 10 degrees in the exact same city. Having trees in your neighborhood can decrease the temperature you experience in the exact same city by 10 degrees versus having all concrete. Fence-line communities, they suffer the burden, the aesthetic burden of living every day in the shadow of some of these facilities, the health burden of breathing the air that comes out of the smokestacks or bringing the pollution that comes out of the smokestacks. But what about the psychological burden of the trucks that run day and night coming into some of these facilities, going through people's neighborhoods as they worry about their children being outside and how they can keep them safe in the midst of that kind of truck traffic. When we think about dangerous heat island effects, this is something we're living with not just historically, but today. What was it, just on Sunday? Right? Look at the levels of heat that we're experienced, right? And think about that. Why does heat matter? Why does heat island effect matter? Anyone, what causes the highest number of weather-related deaths in this country? A, hurricanes, B, flooding, C, tornadoes, D, wildfires, or E, heat. Heat, 600 to 700 people is an undercount drastically because of the way these deaths are reported, but those are the ones that are attributed per year, greater than all those other disasters combined. And you know who disproportionately suffers from some of these heat effects? People who live in cities. People who live in cities without tree covers. People who are in the inner core of many of our cities around the country. And we know in many cities, those people are disproportionately people of color and low-income persons. So what are some more of those benefits we talked about besides access to green and clean spaces and clean water and clean soil? But what about the higher resilience to natural disasters? What about the ability to come home after a disaster and to have insurance, which everybody doesn't have? Or the ability to leave every time there's a hurricane warning in your city and to have the money to go to a hotel where you can actually pay to stay there until you know it's safe. Everybody doesn't have that. Or the ability to have your own transportation, that if there is a natural disaster, you can get in your own vehicle and drive away. And one of the most significant but undercounted, the environmental benefit of being part of the decision makers. The ability to have control over whether or not something goes in your neighborhood. The ability to make the phone call to say, Mayor, not in this neighborhood. The ability to go to the meeting and say, this should not be in this neighborhood. And to have people listen to you, recognize you, and value what you have to say. The ability to be part of the state agency that makes the decision to say this permit can or cannot be issued. But when we get down to it, there are certain roadblocks that we have to recognize that exist in terms of accomplishing environmental injustice. And there are two kinds of roadblocks I want to talk about today. One roadblock is a roadblock that's ideological. It's a set of ideas and beliefs. This is where anti-racism is so valuable, and I have to lift up Ibram X. Kendi's work on anti-racism, both in the book by that name, but also in his other work. The ideas that we have, as I said earlier, about what racism is, themselves constitute for us a barrier to achieving justice in our society. Let me talk about that in environmental context. What are the ideas that frustrate the efforts that we have to achieve environmental justice? One of them is to say, environmental inequities is just a matter of class. So if you are living in proximity to some polluting facility, if you're exposed to some pollution, if you have more vulnerability to climate, that's just because you happen to be poor, and it sucks to be poor in America, right? That idea becomes a barrier to our ability to address the racial and non-class-based disparities and vulnerabilities and experience of people to the environment. Another example, real estate costs, that's all. The reason a facility goes into a particular location is just the price of the land. That's just really untrue. That has almost no connection to truth. Why is that? Because the greatest expenses that industries have are not the land that they buy. It's the cost of the infrastructure. It's the cost of the development of that land. Massive levels of investment have to be made in infrastructure. That is the critical, most important single expense that they have to deal with. It's not the cost of land. And so where there's infrastructure, there's typically a feasible location to place a facility. As long as there's roads and there's access to the high voltage electricity lines and high levels of sewer connection, they normally can put it there, right? Further, oh yeah, the facility was here and then the people of color just moved there because the land was cheaper than other places, right? Just not always true. Sometimes true. That's not always false, but not always true by any stretch of the imagination. We, in fact, have some research that demonstrates how some industries look for communities based on their racial and ethnic makeup because they believe they can avoid political pushback from those communities. So we have at least one study that showed how the higher percentage of Latinos, higher percentage of Catholic members, all were identified as the path to least resistance when some industries were looking to place facilities. Good environmental protection is race and class neutral. In other words, we're going to do environmental protection that's just going to keep everybody safe, right? Well, the truth of the matter is, everybody is not safe right now. Everybody is not equally protected right now. So more of the same just continues an existing system of disparity and inequity and harm and vulnerability and overburdened populations. And finally, it's not racially discriminatory unless I had a bad reason for wanting to do that. Somehow disregard, a lack of equal consideration, those somehow are not a problem. They are a problem, particularly a historic systemic problem, where we have a society that is grounded in intentional discrimination, housing patterns built around intentional discrimination through redlining, but also racial covenants, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, right? Where the United States Supreme Court said in the progressive era that a racial covenant is not in any way offensive to the United States Constitution or the 14th Amendment because it's a private transaction. And of course, if we go back to that same Reconstruction Supreme Court I mentioned to you that said in 1875, private discrimination is not unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment because it only should reach to the states, right? So we have a series of opinions and decisions that have put us on a path that basically has enshrined certain levels of discrimination in the society. And so in the environmental context, unfortunately, we're still living that out and the consequences of it. Now, what are some ideas that support environmental justice? Well, acknowledging the role of racism historically and in a contemporary context and its influence on environmental decisions. Recognizing that people should have a right to environmental justice. I know in one state, one governor and administration had established an office of, I can just say the state, in Indiana. They had established an office of environmental justice. There was an advocate in the Congress who had pushed for it. She had done a phenomenal job around the issue. Congresswoman Carlton, in fact, was doing environmental justice work in the mid-1990s in Indiana and Indianapolis, a trailblazer. The office was created there to work with the state agency to help address the challenges. And then, I guess by the 2000s, the governor came in and said environmental justice doesn't exist. Put the office out of commission and said you won't do anything in this state agency that relates to environmental justice because it's not a real thing. Valuing community in environmental decision-making. This goes to the idea of justice as recognition, right? Recognizing that the community has particular insights and knowledge about what they're experiencing that other people don't have, and that hearing their voices, whatever their cultural context is, whatever their religious background is critical to being able to solve the problems that they're facing in their community. And recognizing that the intersection of race and gender plays itself out not only in who bears these burdens disproportionately in neighborhoods, but who also is excluded from the decision-making process. Who's not in the boardrooms when those decisions are being made? Who's not one of the persons who's a manager or a CEO, or who's running the state agency, or who's writing the permits, right? The absence of certain people from certain spaces tells us a lot about how people are disproportionately empowered to make an impact on the decision-making processes that face them. All right, so there are institutional roadblocks to environmental justice in the same way that there are ideological roadblocks to environmental justice. One, when there are institutions, be they nonprofit organizations, be they civil rights organizations, be they state or federal institutions, when they say that we protect everyone and without regard to any social inequality, that's going to further the status quo and not address the problem. In the same way, we have to recognize that when we're doing ecological work, we understand that one group of animals is not affected the same way another group of animals is by pollution or by development. We recognize that there's some endangered species, and this endangered species will be adversely affected. For example, bald eagles, right? They'll be adversely affected by certain construction. So therefore, the way the construction is done is to move it away from the bald eagles or has to be accommodated to the existence of the bald eagles present. When we have the same reality in the American society that all communities are not equally affected by development that happens. And the inability to attend to those distinctions is an inability to recognize the reality that people live on a daily basis. And I'm wrapping up here. Environmental protection is about science. We hear that from some institutions. It's not about social issues, right? Elevating science as if addressing social issues is on a lower scale, not as important, not as valuable, is an inability to attend to the people who have the greatest harm. One of the things that we face in environmental context is what you would call cumulative risk or cumulative exposure. Let's talk about cumulative exposure. Cumulative exposure is the exposure that comes from not just what you get from NO2, what you get from particulate matter, what you get from lead. Cumulative exposure is the consequences of having multiple environmental stressors in your system, right? And so if we don't recognize that everybody has a different pollution burden and that we have to attend to the greater burdens to address and attend to the greater harms, we are not going to get to the heart of the scientific problem, right? Which is a biological being that is exposed to different pollutants and will suffer harms as a result. So a scientific analysis of the environmental problem requires recognition comprehensively of the different kinds of exposures that people are suffering. All right. I'm going to move along. Actually, let's get that back. I'm going to move along from this idea of institutional roadblocks that I want you to pay attention to, because if you're going to go out and address this problem, you have to recognize that when you talk to people in the state offices and when you talk to people who are making these permit decisions and you talk to people in the health departments, you're going to get some of this pushback I'm talking about right now. This is the way many people in this environmental context will talk about this problem. It's talked about in a way that fails to address how the history of racial discrimination or how current racial discrimination leads to people to have more burden of pollution than others, and that greater burden has an adverse effect. Institutions that are in charge of environmental decision-making can be the problem or they can be the solution. They're going to be the problem when they aren't willing to center the experiences of the people who are most vulnerable and most harmed. They can be the solution when they're willing to address all of the realities that those people are facing as they move forward with making their decisions. There isn't a neutral ground upon which to stand when the foundation is biased. Lastly, if we want to move forward to addressing environmental justice, then we have to recognize that social processes produce environmental justice, and it's going to take social processes produce environmental injustice, and it will take social processes to eliminate environmental injustices. Let me jump to a case example. All right, so in terms of approaching environmental justice from a practical standpoint, There's 3 fundamental steps I'm going to present you with. One is that we can use tools to do an analysis of where people's exposures to pollution come from. And we can identify where the vulnerabilities are through these tools, okay? And that those tools have to be used when we're making environmental decisions that are going to be protective, okay? Number 2, we take that kind of quantitative data and we marry it with qualitative data that explains the history of systemic discrimination or unfair treatment and how that impacts particular communities that we are dealing with and that are facing environmental challenges. And then thirdly, we have to honor the community's experiences and their own voice as we make decisions, and so we don't make decisions for people, we make decisions with people, okay? 3 practical approaches: quantitative data, qualitative data, meaningful involvement of the communities that it affects, okay? Let's go through an example. So there's a wonderful website out there called Mapping Inequality. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but they basically have taken all of those redlining maps that were in place across the country. They used the ones from 1937. Here's a slide that shows their website and how they've identified those redlining maps at work, right? And you can see green, blue, yellow, and red. Here is a picture of another website, not Mapping Inequality, but the Environmental Protection Agency's EJ Screen website. This is a website that provides empirical data about where pollution exposure exists in the society, in different parts of the country. It breaks it down by the kind of pollutant. It also includes the polluting industry. It also allows you to compare the exposure levels to other people who are exposed across the country or in a particular state. So let's do a quick case study using these 2 tools. This is the mapping tool that we get from Mapping Inequality. You can see this is a map of Baltimore. The red areas were the areas that got Ds, concentrated identification of people of color or mixed race neighborhoods. The yellow areas were areas that scored a bit better, but still were considered someplace that you had to be cautious about lending and probably should not make a loan, okay? Just get a good look at that map. This is Baltimore. You see what's red, you see what's yellow. These also were areas that were highly representative of people of color. Because if people of color lived in your neighborhood, you couldn't get a green. Let's just be clear, right? Racial integration was disfavored, and if you had people of color in your neighborhood and it was a mixed neighborhood or integrated neighborhood, it could not get a green, okay? That was a basis to get a lower score in and of itself, okay? So let's look at Baltimore today. Now, this is a map of where people of color are today in Baltimore. And you can see, let's go back, there's more people of color in Baltimore today than there was then, but you can see some of those original areas are still largely represented by people of color. Let's look at who has exposure to particulate matter, 2.5, one of the most hazardous air pollutants that we deal with today because of its impact on lungs, right? Let's go back, take a look. Here, red, 95 to 100% people of color, yellow or dark yellow, 90 to 95, 80 to 90% bright yellow. You see who's exposed to particulate matter in Baltimore? See the disparities that we're talking about? The most heavily concentrated areas with people of color are also the most heavily concentrated areas with particulate matter exposure. Further, they also are the areas that have the heaviest level of asthma, right? So we can look at history, we can look at where environmental burdens are, and we can look at racial identity, and we can find they all come together like this, right? And that tells us what environmental justice is. Environmental justice is eliminating that reality. It's changing that narrative. It's environmental decisions that do not further those inequities and injustices. Environmental decisions that begin with that, when you start making a decision about Baltimore and air pollution, you recognize that that's the status quo, and you act to change it. So there are a couple of pieces I want to lift up before we wrap up. One is that there are tools that we can use legally to help address these issues. One is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution is still around. It still is the basis of bringing a claim for racial discrimination. It's hard to produce a successful case under the 14th Amendment, but it's not impossible. There are still tools that can be used to address racial disparities and inequality and decisions under the 14th Amendment. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, under agency regulations, HUD regulations, EPA regulations, prohibits discriminatory effects, right? Criteria or methods of administering a program that have the effect of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Title VI allows you to file a complaint with the agencies or to bring a civil case in court against agencies for allowing their grant recipients under Title VI to use their money in a way that has a disparate impact. There is a lot of fear out in the Department of Justice about getting a case before the Supreme Court today based on Title VI. I'll tell you that. But that does not prevent filing a claim and getting action by different agencies at the administrative level. Further, many states have passed environmental justice laws, and state courts are recognizing and enforcing those laws. For example, in Virginia, there are certain laws that analysis has to be made of communities before certain siting decisions have been made. And when that analysis has not been upheld, the Virginia Supreme Court has said that is not an acceptable decision because it violates environmental justice. So there are tools, and I've given you a set of mapping tools that can help you get an understanding of what the baseline is that can help you deal with environmental justice when this is a problem that your clients are facing. And it's a problem that people are experiencing all over. I'll make one quick note. In fact, the United Nations is doing an investigation of how people are doing under the Sustainable Development Goals. And they have a project that's going around the United States right now, meeting in major cities to evaluate how African Americans and descendants of African people are doing relative to Sustainable Development Goals. And the number one complaint that has been heard in these sessions around the country have all been environmental. This environmental issue is huge. It's important for each of us to attend to it. It is a premier civil rights issue that affects people's lives on a daily basis, and we've got to work to address it. Thank you very much.
I think we may have time for a question or two. So we have the mic here if there are any questions.
Thank you, Professor, for that incredible lecture. I would like to know your views about the Inflation Reduction Act and the executive order on Justice 40. In your view, is that enough to get to where we need to get to, or what else can the United States be doing, particularly in this era of pushing for renewable projects, which we need for climate reasons, but at the same time, there, I think, is a massive disregard for social issues associated with development of those projects. Thank you.
Excellent question, excellent question. Thank you so much for that. So two things. One, what we need is legislation. We need legislation to address this issue by the Congress. It's a national issue that warrants congressional attention, but we're probably not likely to get that anytime soon. In the absence of that, we need the executive orders that President Biden has issued. He's issued 3 executive orders that relate to environmental justice. It's huge. put billions of dollars in place to help communities that are on the ground have resources to deal with some of these realities. The Inflation Reduction Act has literally hundreds of billions of dollars that go to communities, environmental justice grants and other grants, greenhouse development grants, and other kinds of grants that all are related to this issue. So yes, you should be aware that as this grant money is going to get spent, people are going to do a lot of development. It's really important that people are centering this issue of anti-racist environmental protection as these funds are being spent. So absolutely, I think the Council on Environmental Quality created their own mapping tool called CGEST that maps the most disadvantaged communities. It looks at multiple factors, but it does not include race because they're using it to help direct how federal funds are going to be spent. And therefore, they did not want to include race and raise the possibility of a Supreme Court challenge to the use of those funds. But the consequences without using race as a specific identifier are not necessarily to prevent the money from going where it needs to go. If you just look at that map that we looked at, the very first one from 1937, or you looked at the map that relates to where PM2.5 is, or if you looked at the map that looked at where asthma is, you could have criteria that defines disadvantage without ever saying race, and you would absolutely address those communities. All right, I think there's one question.
There we go, sorry. Do you have any advice or suggestions for dealing with zoning and land use, particularly in areas near those fence line communities that you identified or that you
I do. So one piece of advice is that there has to be community education and community mobilization to get engaged with the decision-making process, from the early decisions that are made by zoning boards and by city planners. Normally, communities are not getting together in many cases to address problems until they're 75% finished. The decisions are 75% made or 90% made. Then communities become mobilized. We have to create an infrastructure that is preventative and progressive that says, this is what we want our community to look like. And it doesn't include these kind of pollution impacts. And to go to the zoning board to say, this is our vision for our community, and to mobilize people to bring those ideas to the city planners. So it's got to be a proactive approach to mobilize people to influence those decisions.
So in situations where residential communities have already sprung up near, industrial zoning, and that happened a long time ago, how do you then mitigate or address the environmental concerns that they are they're currently having, and they are attributing it to their proximity to light industrial or
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's three things I'll point out. One is that industries need to be good neighbors. So there needs to be a relationship that's developed with the industry that approaches it from the standpoint of being a good neighbor and having influence, recognizing that that plant manager doesn't have the ability to shut it down. But what can it do that makes it a better neighbor? Can they change the route of the trucks? Can they change the time of when they have air emissions that are coming out? Are there things that they can do that will decrease their footprint in the community? Can they help support the community in other kinds of institutional ways? Two, it's really important that communities have the benefit of citizen science, air monitoring, sampling, to help them be good neighbors, to let them know when they aren't. So having communities empowered to have, like the Bucket Brigade and other kinds of community-based organizations using academic institutions to help give them the expertise and the tools to go out there and do sampling. This happens all over the world. We do not have to be limited just because we don't have PhDs living in our community, that we can't sample and let industry know when they're causing harm. But it has to be very precise, and we have to record it, and we have to give that information to the authorities and give that information to the facility, and we can't stop. And number three, I think we have to engage in public campaigns to say when an industry is just being a bad neighbor and a bad industry, and shout it from the rooftops that, hey, we live here, but they shouldn't be putting this chemical, this air pollutant, this water pollutant, and it's having this specific adverse effect on us. We need that to be changed. Sure. Thank you all very much.
We were talking earlier about making relationships through IORA, and indirectly, how I did meet Dr. Waterhouse was through IORA. When some of us were appointed to the state advisory committees through the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So I had an opportunity to serve with him in Indiana while he was at IU, McKinney School of Law, and he absolutely led a lot of our work on environmental justice, and even the school to prison pipeline, you remember that? So he is an amazing academic, and I'm sure that you have seen that today. And again, through IORA, we're fortunate to make connections with people that do this great work. So if you could please just thank him again. And on behalf of IORA, the Board of Directors, and our members, we would like to present you with a token. It is the book Just Action by Leah Rothstein and Richard Rothstein.
Thank you.
So I guess, Jim, you want to come up and make some announcements? Please don't forget to do evaluations. We need you to do that. If there are any lost items, they will be locked in the registration area, so if we are made aware of those. Let's see. Pardon me? Oh, don't forget to use our hashtags and post your photos on social media, and I'm sure Jim is going to come. Stick around for the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We will have some heavy hors d'oeuvres. Please stay and partake. We are going to have a wonderful, wonderful town hall. Jim's going to talk about the tour tomorrow, I'm sure. And just wanted to, one plug for the awards dinner on Wednesday. Please, 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 we will have Laree Daniel Favors. Maybe you've heard of her. On Sirius XM Urban View. She'll be our keynote speaker. We're going to have a fabulous time. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Jim Stowe.
Thank you, Diane. Real quick, again, I know it's been a long, long day for you, but I hope it's been a good day. We've got one more session coming up that's going to be really, really worth your while. So hang in there with us. We'll have you out from that session. Plenty of time for you to get out in our community and have a chance to maybe go to good dinner someplace else that maybe you not have tried before. But as Diane said now, we've already got ordered for you heavy hors d'oeuvres. Heavy hors d'oeuvres. So please, stay and consume these heavy hors d'oeuvres. I can eat only so many cheese balls, so I need your help. Need your help. Okay, the tour tomorrow. There's been some confusion. We'll make sure we get that clear today. If you have registered with the conference, you are on the tour. So there's no money required for that. If you've come with an additional guest, that was what the additional $35 was for. So if you don't have an additional guest with you, then obviously it does not apply to you. But there's somebody who's out there who does have someone that might want to go along with us. To the extent we have space, first come, first serve, that person is certainly welcome to go along with us. And the only thing that's being charged for him or her is just enough to cover our lunch, and that's all. We're not charging anything else. This is not about making any money on the tour. So, Tomorrow, what we're going to do is this. We need to meet in the front of the hotel. That's the front. At between 7:30 and 7:45. Whoa, I see it already, yeah. Okay. So, because we're going to take a symbolic walk from where we are today over to the Josiah Henson Museum. It's about 2 blocks. We're doing so for a number of reasons. Google Josiah Henson, number one, for yourself, so you know who we're talking about. But number two, one of our colleagues, Jim Henson, is a great-great-grandson of Josiah Henson. Jim Henson was also the former director of the Howard County Human Rights Commission and also the deputy director for the state of Maryland, that time Office of Human Rights. And so we are going to pay tribute to him as one of our folks who really led the way in the state of Maryland. He is from the city of Alexandria and did a lot of work there as well. But to pay tribute to him and his life. And so this organization, along with our state organization, will be placing a paver in his memory. And so we'll go over to the area where it'll be placed and then go, in fact, to the Josiah Henson Museum. We'll be there for about 45 minutes only, but significant enough that we, again, acknowledge our colleague, hopefully in a very special kind of way. His wife, Elsie, will be there to receive this from all of us, and so it should be a very powerful moment for this organization. We want to do that for our folks who have, again, sojourned in the field of work, as many of our folks have moved on to, again, to transition. So it's important that we do that. So that's tomorrow morning. So now, for those of you who cannot walk, there may be some people who are in a situation that we're talking about, please see me. Please see me directly, and we'll be able to then work out something for you. But the idea is that we do something together, have a shared experience that we're talking about. Again, it's only 2 blocks. We'll have a police escort over to where we're going. And once we get there, we'll then have our experience at Josiah Henson Museum. And then we will begin the process of loading the buses, going next then to the Smithsonian African American Museum of actually History and Culture is the name of it. I always get it turned around. History and Culture. That's our next stop. We'll be in that museum until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you've got some time to see some things. So I would encourage you tonight, Google it and figure out where you want to spend your time while you're there. You cannot do it in a time frame we have for you at all. You can't begin to see what we're talking about. But we did have you to give a little taste of the museum. How many of you have been already to the museum? Okay, well maybe we shouldn't. Should we go? Oh, okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so we are going, and so we will also have lunch there at the museum in the Sweet Home Cafe. How many have eaten at the cafe before? Good food, right? So we'll be doing that at the cafe. So we'll be doing that by your bus, right? By your bus number. We'll have 5 buses going with us, depending upon the number of people who actually will get up going tomorrow, right? But 5 buses, and so bus 1, we'll give you a schedule, but you'll begin to eat your lunch at 11 o'clock. All right, bus 2 at 11:30, bus 3 at noon, bus 4 at 12:30, and bus 5 at 1 o'clock. That means then, folks, because they cannot accommodate us in a group of 300, right? And remember, we're not the only ones going to be in the museum. So we're trying to figure out ways to manage this in a fair way that allows us to have you get lunch. And once you get lunch, if you're in the earlier group, right, you can go back to the museum, right? But we'll meet in the museum main entrance, or actually just outside, at 1:45. 1:45, because we want to leave. We've got to leave the bus at the museum at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's our goal. Now, if you are looking to stay behind, don't look to stay behind. Be on the bus. Be on the bus. Okay. So we move from there then, folks, over to our next stop is going to be looking at the National Mall. And many of you have seen these things before, but there's something about when you see it with a different set of folks, it's a new experience. So I would hope that even though you've done this maybe sometimes before, do it with this group. Have an experience with this group. So we do the National Mall. We end up at the MLK Memorial. We'll be doing a group picture of all of us at the MLK Memorial. And something that some of you may want to have a copy of, but we'll certainly have a lot of use for it in Iora. And then from there, we head back to the hotel, but on the route we'll stop by Glen Echo Park. You now know the significance of that event and that park and that place. We'll stop there, and there'll be one or two of you may choose to ride the carousel. I haven't ridden one in a long, long time. The horse actually goes up and down quite easily, up and down. At any rate, so the point is that we'll have a chance to have that experience, and we head back here. We should be back in the hotel no later than 5 o'clock, or 5:15. Okay? So any questions about this at all? There's some folks who are not here, so please let them understand that tomorrow morning we want to be able to gather between 7:30 and 7:45. Now we'll have breakfast tomorrow, like we had today, beginning at 7 o'clock. So if you want breakfast, get down and get that pretty early. And we need to be marching off at 7:45, headed over there to our about 10-minute walk to the museum. And from there, we'll catch buses headed then to the museum. Yes, ma'am.
Is there heavy hors d'oeuvres being provided tomorrow?
Great question. Great question. My colleague, very straightforward, said to me, dinner is on your own tomorrow. But I would suggest to you that, where is my colleague, Tammy Dixon Tatum? See Tammy. Tammy knows more about this community than I know about this community, about where to eat and so forth while you're here. She did the scouting for us, so Tammy, thank you. So see Tammy if you have an idea or a question about a good place to eat. Okay, tomorrow night. Now, tomorrow at 7 o'clock, I know we got your days packed pretty full, I realize that. But tomorrow at 7 o'clock, we have a very special treat for you. Those of you who may know the documentary called Who We Are. Does anybody know anything about that documentary? Jeffrey Robinson, a journalist, an author, is the person who actually directed and produced that video. You were given some pre-conference opportunities to see the video so that you can participate more actively in the discussion. That video is still live to be able to be seen through today. So if you get a chance to look at that as well, please look at that so that when we have Jeffrey, who will be here again that evening via streaming, but he'll be live with us to talk about the film, but also hear your concerns, your questions about, again, who we are. It is a chronicle of racism in America, right? Who we are, a chronicle in racism in America. If you happen to have, again, Netflix, it is on Netflix. If you happen to have that on your phone or whatever. Okay, so that's going to be on Tuesday. On Wednesday is a full day of activity you can already see in your program. I won't go over that too much, but you've already talked about the banquet and so forth. And then on Wednesday night, we have a special treat. And where is Cleveland Hart? He's not here right now. But at any rate, the Voices of Classic Soul will be performing us on that evening on Wednesday as part of our banquet event. No, I am not one of the voices of Classic Soul. However, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you're in for a treat. You really are. And so we'll finish the evening that way with some dancing and so forth. We'll have a grand time on Wednesday evening at the banquet. So any questions about that? And then Thursday morning, by the way, it's going to be another Power Pack half day on housing issues. And particular concern is the issue of land loss, particularly in communities of color. And on the issue of heir property, H-E-I-R property, that sometimes gets away from many of us who have those kind of situations, and all of a sudden that value is gone, and somebody else comes in and redevelops that same property, and you don't even have access to it any longer. And so a big discussion on that. And then the next piece of that is, what do you do with the land? Maybe get the issue resolved. What do you do with the land? And so we'll have a discussion about those who have some ideas and strategies about what you can do once you get the land under your ownership again. So really important Thursday to finish up our conference going forward. We'll have a full breakfast on Thursday morning. And for those of you who are going on your way back home, you at least will have had a full breakfast to get there. And those of you who will be able to stay with us, we'll have a grand half day as we close out this, I hope, has been a very productive conference for all of you. So any question about any of that? That's a lot.
No, we're just trying to stay on track.
That's a lot. Any questions? Okay. Thank you, folks. We've got then those heavy hors d'oeuvres. And then back here at 5:15. 5:15, we started with a very powerful panel on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington.